Welcome back. In our earlier class, we were talking about Plato and his concept of mimesis and his opinion about poets in the Republic and how they should be banished for various reasons. So, today we will be talking about classical theory. We will be continuing what is classical theory in terms of particularly with reference to the Greek classical theory. Key person here is Aristotle. We will be discussing Aristotle and his theory of poetry and tragedy, particularly with reference to his poetics. So, key person is Aristotle and key terms are mimesis, catharsis, of course, Aristotle's concept and theory of tragedy, plot, character and what is meant by hamartia. Okay. So, what is the mimesis? Let us continue with a little more discussion of mimesis. So, mimesis is a critical and philosophical term that carries a wide range of meanings including imitation and representation. It imitates, it represents, it also mimics, and you can look at mimesis from all these perspectives, from all these angles. Mimesis as a concept tries to make sense of representational art and its values. For Plato, literature was mere shadow of reality and truth belonged to the philosopher king and not the poet. So, this is important. Philosopher is important, as important as a king and not the poet. So, the idea of mimesis was emphasized by Aristotle in his Poetics. He refuted Plato and points out that literature is unfettered by the accidents of history and can articulate eternal or higher truths. Now, we have seen that Plato's negative view of art stems from the view that poetry is mimetic and is cut off from reality. He believes that artistic mimesis addresses itself essentially to the emotional rather than the intellectual. Aristotle also distinguishes poetry from other arts and then makes distinctions between the various poetic kinds such as drama, tragedy, epic and comedy. Now, at this point let me quote an excerpt from Aristotle's Poetics. This is what Aristotle has to say about poetry. Poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons, and no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. The cause of this again is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure not only to philosophers, but to men in general, whose capacity however of learning is more limited. Thus, the reason why men enjoy seeing a likeness is that in contemplating it they find themselves learning or inferring and saying perhaps. Imitation then is one instinct of our nature. Next, there is the instinct of harmony and rhythm, meters being manifestly section of rhythm. Persons therefore is starting with this natural gift, developed by degrees their special aptitudes till their rude improvisations gave birth to poetry. So, in other words, he talks about how poetry is an art and how we enjoy the art of imitation, which is something extremely universal and not particular to any individual. For Aristotle, mimesis describes a process involving the use by different forms of different means of representation and different levels of moral and ethical behaviors as objects of the artistic representation. Aristotle thus distinguishes between tragedy and comedy essentially on the grounds that tragedy appeals to the noble while comedy depicts ignoble characters and also appeals to the baser instincts. Aristotle also suggests that art moves us and that is one of its primary reasons for existence. He notes that Athenian women had been known to miscarry and boys to faint when watching tragedy, but the emotion that tragedy generates according to Aristotle is cathartic. So, here we come to his concept, immortal concept of catharsis. In fact, the word catharsis which has its roots in medicine, but it has been brought into literature by Aristotle. Consider for example, how Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream proclaims that the lover, the lunatic and the poet are of imagination all compact. The idea that the poet and the lunatic are quite similar, it has been there in existence since the classical times and was carried forward by Shakespeare. Remember also how Hamlet in the play of the same name advises the players who come to his castle and he advises them to be real, to be true to life. So, in other words, Shakespeare is also referring to imitation, to mimicking life, representing life as it is. So, let me quote you a few lines from Shakespeare's Hamlet also at this point. This is what Hamlet advises. This is his advice to the players. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is, to hold as it were the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. So, in other words, to be as realistic as possible. The key literary works or critical works that deal with the idea of mimesis. Let me point your attention towards the bibliography. So, most important work that has been done on mimesis is Eric Auerbach's book. It is called Mimesis, and other two books that I would like to draw your attention to are David Macy's Penguin Dictionary of Critical Theory and Russell and Winterbottom's Classical Literary Criticism. So, you will get a familiarity, you will understand what mimesis is in greater depth if you look at these works. Now, let us move on to talk about Aristotle. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, writer, he lived between 384 to 322 BC. He was Plato's student at the academy. Academy, as we have already talked about, was a school of learning founded by Plato. Aristotle made contributions in the areas of metaphysics, logic, ethics, politics, literary criticism, and most importantly in the field of natural sciences. Later on, Aristotle started his own school called the Lyceum in Athens. He has given us 10 categories through which we can view the world, and you will understand how important these categories still are to understand the way we live, to understand the world around us. These categories are whatness, which means the substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action and affection. So, these are the categories Aristotle is interested in, and these are the categories through which we understand the world around us. Aristotle's greatest contribution to philosophy lies in the area of logic, where he used syllogism as the basis. However, our interest in this particular lecture is his immortal Poetics. So, in his work Poetics, Aristotle expresses his view on tragedy. For Aristotle, poetry and rhetoric had the status of productive sciences. These domains had their place in a hierarchy of knowledge. Let me quote from Aristotle's Poetics and his concept of tragedy. And here is the oft repeated definition of tragedy by Aristotle. Tragedy then is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of a narrative, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. Every tragedy therefore must have 6 parts, which parts determine its quality, namely plot, characters, diction, thought, spectacle, melody. So, according to Aristotle, tragedy is the imitation of an action. So, again we come back to our concept of mimesis, and he indicates that the medium of tragedy is drama, not narrative. For Aristotle, the subject matter of tragedy is a course of action which is morally serious, presents a complete unity and occupies a certain magnitude. Since a tragedy is essentially dramatic rather than narrative, it represents men in action, and a well constructed tragedy provides catharsis of various emotions, particularly pity and fear. So, what is catharsis? Catharsis for Aristotle suggests purification or purgation of the emotions. As already discussed, the term is derived from the medical word catharsis, which means purgation or cleansing. Aristotle uses the term to describe the effects of true dramatic tragedy on the spectator. As we know, for Aristotle, the purpose of tragedy is to arouse terror and pity and thereby effect the catharsis of these emotions. Aristotle's meaning has been the subject of critical debate over the centuries. Many critics saw tragedy as a moral lesson in which the fear and pity excited by the tragic hero's fate served to warn the spectator, not similarly to tempt fate. The interpretation generally accepted is that through experiencing fear vicariously, the spectator's own anxieties are directed outward, and through sympathetic identification with the tragic protagonist, his insight and outlook are enlarged. The key words here are sympathetic identification and purgation and cleansing. So, we have to understand here that for Aristotle, though plot is extremely important, but so is the character, because one has to identify with the character, especially the protagonist, and then therefore, we will go on to discuss his concept of the ideal tragic hero as well. So, for Aristotle, tragedy has a humanizing effect on the audience, and as modern scholars, we should also understand that a tragedy should have a humanizing influence not just on the audience, but also on the readers. Tragedy, like comedy, originates in mimesis and is expressed as dithyramb, which is a hymn sung to Dionysus. Now, this we have to understand that Dionysus in Greek mythology is the god of fertility and wine, later considered a patron of the arts. We have two concepts, Apollonian and Dionysian. So, the Apollonian is based on reason and logical thinking. By contrast, the Dionysian is based on chaos and appeals to the emotions and instincts. So, tragedy is a song, is a hymn to the to Dionysus. So, tragedy for Aristotle is the domain of the more serious poets. On the other hand, the less serious represent low sentiments. Let us move on to talk about plot now, the tragic plot. For Aristotle, plot is the imitation of a whole action. A tragedy must be based on a certain structure of events or incidents to which the specific actions of the characters contribute. According to Aristotle, the most important feature of the plot is unity. For him, the component incidents must be so arranged that if one of them be transposed or removed, the unity of the whole is dislocated and destroyed. We already know that for Aristotle, a plot is a whole that has a beginning and middle and end. A beginning causes something else, a middle both follows from something else and results in something else, while an end is what necessarily follows from something else, but does not produce a further result. So, end is an end in itself, okay. There cannot, it is not open ended, in other words, okay. And writers followed this construction, this plot construction for several centuries. The unity of the plot is based on a notion of causality. So, therefore, we have a term like cause effect relationship. Something happens and as a result of that something happens. So, cause and effect. Aristotle is interested in plots such as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. So, this is a play that he keeps going back to. For Aristotle, this is one of the best and most tightly constructed plots ever. The action here is marked by a movement through reversal, recognition and suffering. Aristotle explains that pity is aroused by undeserved misfortune. Fear is aroused when we realize that the man who suffers such misfortune is like ourselves, and think Oedipus in this context, whose fate, whose suffering is largely undeserved, and we fear his fate because we fear that such a misfortune can befall people like us as well. Aristotle's main focus in the Poetics is on the genre of tragedy, but he also later on makes important comments on comedy and epic. For him, tragedy is superior to epic because of its much more compact structure. Aristotle considers the much greater length of epic with its plot and emphasis on subplots as well as a hindrance to the lucid unfolding of the poem's theme. So, let us move on to talk about tragic hero. Who is a tragic hero according to Aristotle? For Aristotle, a tragic hero is a man of eminence, he is a man of stature. I keep going back to Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. And I urge you to read Oedipus. It is a trilogy, however, to understand Aristotle's concept of a perfect tragedy, it is important to have some acquaintance with Sophocles' Oedipus. So, Oedipus, does he fit the bill of an ideal tragic hero? Well, you see, he is a man of eminence, and that is what is one of the key requirements of an ideal tragic hero according to Aristotle. He is a man of stature. So, after all, he is the king, and he is also a wise ruler, a just ruler. His people love him and they trust him. He is also the one who has solved the riddle of the Sphinx. Okay. So, he is no ordinary man, he is a man of eminence. For Aristotle, an ideal tragic hero should also be a good man. And yes, Oedipus is a good man because he rules the kingdom wisely and justly. Uh, germane to this idea is that a villain cannot be the hero. A person who is basically wicked or villainous or bad cannot be the hero. The concept of anti-hero came in literature much later, that here we are still talking about the concept of an idealized hero who has to be essentially good and a man of stature. So, remember, uh, people of lower ranks, especially slaves, they do not have any place in tragedy. So, they cannot be the hero, they cannot be the idea that a common man can also be an apt subject for a tragedy. These ideas are much more recent. Okay. But for Aristotle, an ideal tragic hero must essentially be a man of stature and eminence. He should also be consistent. Consistent means there should be a kind of consistency in his character. So, there cannot be sudden shifts in the way he acts or speaks or behaves. So, for Aristotle, these are the key ideas of an ideal tragic hero. You can apply this concept to other great heroes as well. Consider Hamlet. Is he a man of stature? He is. He is the Prince of Denmark. Okay. Is he a good man? Yes, you cannot debate that. He is essentially a good man. Is he consistent? By and large, he is consistent, and even his tendency to procrastinate, that is also consistent to a large extent. So, yes, a great character should essentially possess these attributes. This brings us to the concept of hamartia. Now, what is hamartia? Hamartia for Aristotle is an error of judgment which may arise from ignorance or some moral shortcoming. So, while discussing the ideal tragic hero, Aristotle points out that the tragic hero ought to be a man whose misfortune come to him not through any depravity, not through any moral error or sin, but by some flaw, and that is called his fatal flaw or tragic flaw, and that is what Aristotle means when he says hamartia. So, let us go back to Oedipus. So, Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother out of ignorance, and this killing of father happens out of sheer impulse. Now, another great tragic character, Antigone, again by Sophocles, and Antigone is the as we know, Antigone is Oedipus's daughter. So, Antigone resists the law of the state because of sheer defiance. So, while Oedipus's fatal flaw is his impulsive nature, Antigone's flaw is her tendency to defy the law of the state. Hamlet, as we all know, procrastinates too much, and yet another great Shakespearean hero, Othello, he too is impulsive. So, these are the examples of tragic flaws in literary characters. So, essentially good people, people of high stature, but there is a kind of fatal flaw in their character which leads to their downfall. So, all these are related to Aristotelian concept of tragedy and plot and character. Aristotle also gives us two important concepts One is peripety, that is a reversal of fortune, which is brought about because of the hero's error in judgment. Another concept is anagnorisis, which is the discovery or recognition that the reversal was brought about by the hero's own actions. So, peripety and anagnorisis. Now, what is Aristotle's legacy? The Poetics is generally regarded as the most influential treatise in the history of literary criticism. I am talking essentially of Aristotle's legacy in terms of literary criticism. Of course, we know he has made immense contribution in other fields also, but our concern for this course is literary criticism. So, his legacy continues in the form of the Poetics. Poetry, according to him, does not express what is unique about individuals, but rather their universal characteristics. Aristotle compares poetry to philosophy because it deals in general truths, unlike history, which merely records what happens. With Poetics, we move away from poetry as ethics towards poetry as aesthetics, and much of the literary criticism that we do today, for all that we are indebted to Aristotle. So, that is going to be my talk on Aristotle. We will continue with a discussion of Roman philosophers and critics in our next lecture. Now, coming to your quiz and assignment. So, here there is a quick quiz for you to do, and please submit the answers by the deadline. Question 1. What do you understand by the term mimesis? What advice on play acting does Shakespeare's Hamlet give to the players? Third question. What is Dionysian, and what does Aristotle mean by catharsis? We will continue in the next class. Thank you very much.